let's get things going. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Max, one of the founders here at World Forum Disrupt. For anyone who's new to World Forum Disrupt, we're a business events company focusing on facilitating thought-provoking and innovative conversations around a number of different topic areas, one being software development, which is of course why you guys are joining us today. We're always super excited to be able to bring free content to our audience, but of course that wouldn't be possible without the support from some of our partners. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank Dev Factory, who are the guys behind the software suite DevGraph. Not only have DevGraph helped us put this webinar together, but we're fortunate enough to have the CEO of Dev Factory, which is the company who owns DevGraph software suite, Raul, join our panel today. So we're really thankful for them, guys. If you haven't heard of DevGraph software before, be sure to check them out. Drop down your email in the chat function and one of their team will get in touch. So we have an amazing webinar for you today. We're joined by some outstanding speakers who will take the hour to take a deeper look at the challenges we face when balancing developer productivity with software quality. If any of you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function, and our panelists will do their best to get to those questions at the end of the session. Awesome. So without further ado, I just want to introduce James Rutt, who is the Chief Information Officer at Dana Foundation. James will be wearing a couple of hats for us today. Not only is he moderating the panel, but he'll also be providing his insight as one of the panelists. So without further ado, I'll hand over to James.
Max, thank you so much. And it's great to be back with World Forum Disrupt. And thank you for having me again. This is our second go around. It's very exciting. I'm anticipating a great conversation today around code quality and some of the aspects, some of the challenges that we're all facing, and it's going to be a very good conversation, especially based on the pre-call that we had. I'm looking forward to it very much. So I'll give a brief overview of some of the things that we're going to be covering. One, as Max mentioned, we're going to be speaking about this balance between delivering quality code and delivering fast features, and ultimately what our business counterparts are looking for, right? Which is the results of our hard work, and how to balance that properly and how to motivate our teams to do such. We'll also be talking a little bit about technical debt, its impact, how it should be managed, and when it should be leveraged. I think this, looking at it from one side only as a negative is not necessarily a cogent thing to be talking about. There's many instances where it could be leveraged to our advantage. So that'll be another thing we'll be talking about as well. As well as hopefully we'll get some quantitative measures, some metrics that are absolutely most effective in balancing this whole code quality issue. I think everybody's looking for that quantitative measure that they can give to their board, or that they can show the absolute impacts of their productivity, but there are a lot of metrics floating out there that may not be appropriate for your use, or there may be ones that have been out there for a while that don't necessarily tell the tale, so to speak. So it's going to be a great conversation, I think. Based on some of the reception on some of the questions I'll be asking already, I think it's going to be tremendous. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. Just your name, title, and company, I think will be fine, and let's get to it. So Warren, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, James, and thanks, Max. Warren Lenard, I'm the Chief Information Officer for Buyrider, located in Carmel, Indiana. We are a buy here, pay here, used car and auto financing dealership, and we cater to the subprime market.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Warren. Rahul. You're on mute.
Hey, everyone. I'm Rahul Subrahmanyam. I'm the CEO of Dev Factory, which is basically the company that owns the product suite called DevGraph. And we build a lot of enterprise products. We are part of a larger group called ESW Capital, with a group of about the portfolio of about 130 plus enterprise software companies that we operate.
Excellent. Thanks, Rahul, and thanks for your sponsorship today. Ivo.
Hey everyone, my name is Ivo Yue. I'm a Director of Software Development and Data Operations for Envision Healthcare. And specifically, we position radiologists and other physicians to work at and remotely from the hospital. So in regards to today's topic, if quality is not there, patients suffer.
No truer words were ever said. Thank you so much, Ivo. So let's get to it. So I'm going to start, Warren, if we could start with you. Let's get your feedback on kind of the overarching subject here, which is code quality. How would you define code quality? And talk to us a little bit about the struggles that you have balancing code quality with developer productivity, and more importantly, the features that you're ultimately delivering to your business counterparts.
So, I mean, at a very high level, I'm going to define code quality and really in product quality. Not everything that we deliver as far as a product is coded or built. We do buy, but when we do build, the quality of our code is going to obviously influence the quality of the products that we deliver. The customers on the other end of the products we deliver, internal department and business associates, as well as our end customers on the other end, are the benefactors of those particular products. They're not looking for good code quality, they're looking for good products. So our high level definition is, as we release product, does it do what it was intended to do? Are we matching and are we aligned on the requirements that we have gotten from the business side of the house? I have found that, especially when I got here to Byrider, there was a major misalignment on what was required from the business and what IT was delivering. And when you're getting it that wrong from the beginning, there's no good end to that story. Starting out and aligning with business requirements is ensuring that what the business is expecting and what you're delivering is critical. From that point, it gets deeper into how you're going about building your products. Do you have a set of development concepts? Do you have, architectural goals and things like that? Are they reviewed across your teams? Not every team is built the same way, but I think you need to kind of define a framework for those teams of how they're building products. And there are certain things you can institute that can actually ensure that quality. Things like I eliminated when I got here kind of a break fix team, because I felt like that was counter to releasing good quality code. And we changed the philosophy here to, if you build it, you support it. And that had a dramatic change on the quality and the products that we delivered. It's not that anybody is maliciously just throwing code out there and throwing it over the fence, but at the end of the day, if you have skin in the game, that's going to make all the difference in the world to know that you're diagramming, you're coding, you're documenting the things that you're supposed to be doing are going to come back to you. So, build it right the first time and build it in alignment with these ethics that we have put together that will dictate good code quality and ultimately drive good product quality.
It sounds like when you got there, you definitely firmed up some of the gaps on the development operations side. It sounds like some bit nuts and bolts there, and it looks like obviously it's had a positive impact. I'm curious about something you said before. When you came on board, it seems like the legacy processes that were joining the customer requirements along to development seemed like, to me, from your description, that they were somewhat broken. We know some common methods that could be used, like good user stories, et cetera, to kind of help close that gap. Were there any other unique ways that you kind of close that gap so that your development team was on target to the true end user requirements in development?
Sure. I'll answer that in a couple of parts. So to kind of even qualify your statement, it wasn't that the processes were broken. They were kind of non-existent.
Oh, wow.
There was a lot of stuff that really was kind of built off the cuff. I'm not to say that there wasn't a process, but it was very ambiguous and it was very inconsistent. Teams were operating in different ways. So you had different agile teams that were covering different products. We're just working towards different end goals and different philosophies. but we had no really tried and true processes that we could really take the business through. And, you know, this wasn't just a one-sided story of IT over-promising and under-delivering. The business had to come along as well. I made some significant changes within the staffing and within the processes, but then I turned my attention to my business compatriots and said, you've got to come along for the ride too, because you have developed bad habits along the way in, you know, hallway conversations, off the cuff requirements that you just felt were going to be built and never did. So we implemented kind of 3 different types of meetings that really make up the entire structure for our development. Steering committee meetings were one, in which we brought all of the business units together with that particular product team and we meet on a monthly basis to go over status, to go over anything that has come up, and also ideation as well. We have a bi-weekly meeting called IT governance, where we take the senior management team through, which I'm part of, the status of all of our initiatives, where there might be some hiccups, where there might be delays, where we're actually, you know, working according to plan, and where we may be ahead of schedule. And then probably the third and the most important, and this is really kind of the guts of it all, is we have a quarterly planning session. And this is where we bring the product team, and not only the product team, but our DevOps, our SysOps, our DBAs, lots of folks from IT gather along with the business groups. And we literally go through all of the things that we are planning for the following quarter. From a development standpoint and a build standpoint, we have a bucket of hours that are available. And of course, we trim that bucket because we hold aside things like break fix and all sorts of unplanned work. And we take that bucket, we put up the list of initiatives, and we size them live right in that session along with the business. We prioritize them, and then we decrement from the bucket. And when we get to 0, that's the next quarter's worth of work. There are no ifs, ands, or buts. And we hold strong to that. And I'm telling you, as much as people may leave those meetings sometimes with, you know, a sour face, at the end of the day, they have come to really enjoy it, because I've had many people from the business come to me and say, you know, if you guys do deliver what we just talked about in that meeting, I'd be satisfied. And that's what's gone on. So by doing it and taking the business through that process, we've level set the reality, and we actually deliver what we say we're going to deliver because it's real.
Yeah, that's marvelous. I think you've achieved the Rosetta Stone, so to speak, overall in making the business side understand that they've got a role and they've got responsibilities in this role as stakeholder. And it seems like you've added some great practical elements, especially during these quarterly stand-up meetings. These are definitely things that I think would operate well in most development organizations, and you're to be commended. It's a tremendous lift.
Well, the other thing, James, it takes IT out of the role of decisioning as far as prioritization. We step back and we say to the business, you folks decide, what would you like us to work on? And it gets down to it sometimes where one business unit will say, well, this is important to me for X, Y, and Z. And another business unit says, well, this one's important to me for A, B, and C. And they get to kind of duke it out, if you will. And there are times when our CEO has got to make the decision.
Absolutely. Great feedback. Thank you so much, Warren. Rahul, how would you feed off of what Warren was just saying and kind of add some more color to that statement?
Yeah, I think overall, when we talk about product quality, there are different vectors and different components that you need to go address. We slice it slightly differently, given that we have the scale of having to manage over 600 million lines of code across 130 plus products, all centrally in the same way. So the way we slice it overall in terms of product quality is we have commercial product management, which is what Warren talked about is in terms of the business side of it, where we actually require business to be explicit about what they want the product to be and why from a commercial standpoint. The second part of it is the technical product management, which actually breaks down based on the commercial product decisions that they make about what they want. They break down into the core technical decisions that you want to make about your product and how you're going to go implement it. Then comes engineering architecture, which is the third piece of it, which is creating the blueprint for how you're going to actually go implement and um, drive the code implementation. And then there, of course, is the code implementation part of it. So we kind of drive this more like a factory because of our scale. Otherwise, this is, you can't have meetings where everyone comes in our world, because I mean, it's just way too much to go deal with. So we break it down into more concrete functions, but it also allows us to be very specific about the inputs and outputs that we really expect out of every function. And we start to hold each one of them, to a certain bar. I think from an engineering standpoint, since we're specifically talking about the code quality part of it, that lies, if you set the right boundaries, that lies solely and squarely within engineering alone, because they are responsible for the code that they write. And if you've got the right commercial product management vision defined, the technical product management vision defined, and then the overall architecture that has been defined, then the part of what translates into code should be fairly descriptive and not very ad hoc. Okay, now that doesn't always happen. You always find gaps, but the more you work towards closing those gaps or putting those guardrails, you actually can then end up with fairly predictable code that goes into your code bases.
Yeah, I love the factory analogy, because just like a regular production factory, you're trying to reduce variance. And it sounds like you've done a great job of, quote unquote, templating these processes, making them repeatable, eliminating the variance wherever possible, understanding that you can't maybe get into the weeds, so to speak, in terms of the individual coordination points from a human perspective, due to the fact you've got this disparate amount of projects, et cetera. So you're doing the next best thing. And that's tremendous feedback. Thank you so much. Now, Ivo, I think when we talk about code quality, in healthcare, and I've been in healthcare, so I definitely have some empathy here. It takes a slightly more serious impact there. And I think you led off with a great statement. I'd like you to feed off of that and add a little more detail.
Yeah. So in regards to code or product quality, I think what a lot of people tend to zoom in on is the testing aspect of the code, right? To ensure that the code was written to spec. And then, as Warren indicated, there is an assumption that the spec is correct. And it requires a tremendous amount of product management to ensure that what IT and software dev is working on actually aligns with what the business needs are. A lot of developers look into the spec as, okay, this is what I've been asked to do. I'm going to code to spec. We've all heard developers say, oh, it was never coded to do that, or it works on my machine, or whatever the statements that we've heard from devs, right? And for us, it goes back to the mission of delivering great healthcare and positioning our physicians to succeed. And that brings us to a saying that all software models something in real life. All models are wrong, but some are useful, right? Some are useful, and we want to ensure that the software we're writing models the thing in real life in a useful way. And the more useful it is, the higher quality it is. And we've also heard that developers say, it was never written to do this, and now I'm going to have to either refactor or rewrite this thing. And then we start getting into the tension that that's the topic of our webinar today, of, well, do I have time to rewrite it? Do I have time to do what I want to do with this? Or do I need to shove this thing out the door because the business says they need it? In the space of healthcare, it can be, there are patient lives at stake right now, so we have to actually work on this until we get it done. And maybe we need to band-aid and we need to patch this, and then we'll come back to it later. But Warren brought up, I think, a great point in scheduling work, whether that work is scheduled for a month, a quarter, whatever that looks like. But if you are in a business similar to healthcare, where a lot of the operations are not just day to day, but hour to hour, minute to minute, because of how quickly things change in the business, then it can be difficult to say, we're going to schedule work for this longer period of time and that's it, right? We have to allocate some bucket of time that's a little bit more ambiguous to say, for example, I'm going to allocate 80%, 70, 80% of my time to this scheduled work. 20-30% of the time is going to be kind of up in the air because we know things are going to happen day to day and it's going to interrupt our delivery. And as Warren said, we don't want to overpromise and to deliver, and we know this is going to happen. We have a tight enough understanding of the business and the day-to-day, hour-to-hour operations to understand that. So I think it requires a deeper understanding of what the business domain looks like across the board. And I would also like to add, in addition to just the software that comes out, many businesses are turning to data to make decisions, whether that data analysis is more descriptive, all the way through the maturity level to becoming prescriptive. And I would say that not all developers, but a lot of developers, their concern with data ends at storage. And if that's the case, then the product quality is going to be kind of low, because we're not going to be able to capture enough information to make better decisions of how to make the model of our software more useful.
So it's a very interesting point, both from a data and also a very regulated industry such as such as healthcare as well. One thing that sticks in my mind, and I can speak from experience, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, is especially when you talk about data privacy, data governance, all these different things. Can you talk a little bit about some of the conversations you've had with, say, risk or compliance folks about the impact to protecting, governing, and the provenance of that kind of data?
Yeah, so I think the simplest way to approach it is usually in access control, who gets to touch the data, right? And for developers, that actually introduces a challenge because they may need to see the real world data instead of the obfuscated data. And they're challenged to say, well, I know that my code can handle these primary use cases and these assumptions about the data, but as soon as data comes in that doesn't match that pattern, which it does, it breaks stuff, right? So I think that definitely introduces that challenge where obfuscation may not purely rely on, say, encryption, but whether it's tokenization or masking, to position the developers to be able to access realistic data without letting them have access to the real true data in order to protect the data privacy that you're mentioning, James.
Yeah, I think it was a science in and of itself when I was in healthcare in terms of just de-identification of data, right? I mean, it was, do you scramble this data so it's at least machine and human readable, as opposed to tokenizing it, encrypting it, somehow other, obfuscating the data, and what are going to be the downstream impacts in either case. So it was a big, long discussion, and definitely in my mind, relevant to development cycles, et cetera. So thank you so much for your input there, Ivo. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about technical debt a little bit more in detail. There's this balance as all of our panelists have brought up, in terms of how quick can we develop versus the quality of the code that we're ultimately delivering, which may or may not be appreciated by our end customer, whoever that may be, internal or external. I also mentioned at the outset of this that there's ways that you can use technical debt as a positive, not just a negative. So I'd love to hear from some of our panelists here how they're leveraging it, or how, in the obverse, how they may be managing it to a risk that's acceptable to the respective teams. So Rahul, let's start with you, because you have a lot of moving parts at Dev Factory, and I'd love to hear if you've got some kind of unique way, or what your philosophy is on managing tech debt.
Yeah, so I think if you look at the profile of the kind of code bases that we own, they are typically 10 to 40 years old. And there's a ton of accrued debt just because of age. even if you wrote the best code ever at a particular point of time, in 3 years' time, that becomes dead. So if you really look at it from the financial analogy standpoint, what you are writing into your code base is a liability at all points of time. Okay, so even though we call it technical debt, more than a debt, it's not so much as a debt that you're right. Even if you wrote the best piece of code that you wrote, you're actually putting in liability. So that's part one. The second part, if you really break down the anatomy of a typical enterprise product code base, you'll find that, and especially ones that are at least 5 years old, you'll find that about 80% or more of the code base is infrastructure or support code for some core business operations and logic. Okay. And the other reality is that a vast amount of that is getting cut down and being offered as commodity infrastructure by a bunch of cloud providers or even via third-party libraries. Okay, so the need to build something in-house is becoming increasingly less important. Okay, and the third piece of it is, and this is a slightly this is an interesting first principles, mental exercise where if you really go to do the root cause of most problems that you have in code, and I'm just talking about code, I'm not talking about product, I'm talking specifically about code. The reason why you have those is because somebody wrote some code, right? So that's the first principles, analysis of issues that you have. If people didn't have to write code at all, you wouldn't have those problems. But again, it's not. It's like I said, it's a thought exercise that you do. But when you take that as a core first principles takeaway, and you bring it up to a high level, you want to write as little code as possible to have as little technical debt and as little problems specifically owing to code. Okay, that's one way. The other thing that we usually do, or I at least ask all of my teams to do with every commit, is literally tell me why it is really easy to delete the code that they just wrote. Okay, and it came from a lot of thinking about how do I get my teams to follow the best, solid principles or the best object-oriented principles or whatever the best programming practices are. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to all of those are designed to create structure in such a way that tomorrow, if you had something better and new, it'd be super easy to swap out something old with something new, right? It's just supposed to be modular. It's supposed to be it's supposed to be as decoupled as possible with every other component. Those are all the best practices that you want to implement. But if you want to distill it down to one question you want to ask every developer with every commit, it is, tell me or prove to me that it is really easy to delete everything that you just wrote and replace it with something else. And if they can justify that, you know that they've written code the right way. So those are just some of the things that's our way of thinking, just because of the sheer volume of really bad code that we have. Like I said, 600 million lines of really old bad code to go manage. Bad in current context, not bad in the context that they were written in anywhere from 10 to 40 years ago. But in today's context, you wouldn't really do this. And I'm just going to end with one simple example. We acquired a company called Fogbugs a couple of years back. And Fogbugs is basically an issue tracking system. If you guys are familiar with the Trello and the Stack Overflow guys at Fog Creek, it was built by them. It's the first product that Joel Spolsky wrote. It is about 1.7 million lines of .NET code for an issue tracking system. Okay, we as an experiment took that same issue tracking system, and at the end of the day, if you really think about it, it's a glorified cloud applications, but with a couple of very cool, very interesting features. We wrote 2 implementations of the same product, one on Firebase, using all the infrastructure to build these pieces of code with custom fields and custom tables, Instead of using relational stores, we decided to use a document store like Firestore. And then we created another AWS specific implementation for it. And in both of those cases, we could write the entire backend in less than 5,000 lines of code. So over 95% of the code base was infrastructure that had to be written back in the day because all that stuff didn't exist. But today, if you really went ahead and leveraged these services that these cloud providers provide, you've got far more scalability, far more elasticity, far more reliability than you could ever have, that you could more than anything that you could ever build yourself, but with far less code. And that way of thinking is something that drives us day in and day out. The technical debt over there is so little that you can just delete it and rewrite it with something new that comes up, right? It's 5,000 lines of code for the entire backend for an enterprise scale product, right? And that for us is kind of the game changer in managing technical debt.
I think in the beginning, absolutely, especially now in 2020, with the ability to leverage a lot of these, I'll call them templated, cloud environments and all the inner workings, the orchestration around containers, et cetera, like the infrastructure concerns that we all had, a lot of them have been obviated for the most part. The other thing I like, I was thinking back to the first iOS course I took many, many years ago, and he was saying, the instructor said kind of exactly what you said encapsulated, where he said, the best line of code you're ever going to write is the one you don't need to. And it kind of sat with me because understanding whatever we needed to write was eventually going to be debt, as you mentioned so eloquently. So thank you so much, Rahul. Ivo, let's mix it up a little bit. Your thoughts on managing tech debt?
So I would like to add a little bit to some of the and address a couple of points Rahul made. I think when it comes to the build, buy, or lease /rent kind of decision, right? It's actually increasingly more important what we choose to have our developers spend their time on, right? I'm a growing fan of domain-driven design that talks about what are the core subdomains that you want to focus your development efforts on, because the rest of the subdomains within your overall business domain, you should be able to get off the shelf, whether it's security management or logging, or you don't want to spend your own time, your devs' time writing something that you could just buy off the shelf, and have them really focus on creating that competitive advantage for your business, right? One thing that I may have a different definition of tech debt is I don't see tech debt including bugs, and I don't see tech debt including legacy code that becomes stale. What I do see tech debt is as a management decision where we make a choice to say, we're going to take a shortcut here in order to get what we need sooner, but we're going to have to pay it back later with interest because we've already taken the shortcut. And to give an example of how we quantitate this approach, let's say that the team and I were doing a grooming session where trying to estimate the complexity of a problem and sometimes the solution that we're thinking in mind, and we say, the solution is going to take us 3 months, an entire quarter to deliver. The business comes back and says, we can't wait 3 months. We got to have this in a month because a certain client is ready to sign on the dotted line and they're not going to sign without this feature. We've been there, right? And so I see technical debt as the team say, we've either from story points or time estimates, some sort of estimate that says it's going to take us 3 months. That's the right way, the way that we would prefer to do it. And if you need it in a month, we're going to take this shortcut, but we're going to have to eventually do the right way. But we're also going to have to undo or address the month of work that we did to get it in there in the first place. So that's the interest that we have to pay back. So if the 3 months of work, let's say, if I were to convert to story points or something, and by the way, anybody listening, if any leader asks you to convert story points to hour or something, always say no. That's a trap. Never do it, right? But let's say that we're, it's 300 story points for the 3 months and only 40 story points for the month of work, right? Now to undo that 40 story points, you realize, I'm gonna have to do another 30 on top of that. So in total, I'm actually gonna be having the team do 370 story points worth of work. And let's say that in total, it's gonna take 5 to 6 months now, in total, instead of you letting the business that giving me time to do it the way that the team wants to in 3 months. And that's how we kind of position the business. Say, is it worth it? Because there's always the statement, we don't have time to do it right. But then the follow-up question, do you have time to do it twice? Right? And as far as legacy code becoming stale, I don't see the legacy code becoming stale as that whole thing is now the quantitative technical debt. What I see is that first decision that says, we need to do X, but it's very difficult to do with the current code base. So we need to rewrite that code base, refactor that code base, and that goes into the effort that we need to do the right way to do it. But the business comes back and says, we can't wait for you to do that. You just need to slap it on, and now you have a lava pattern in your code or something, right? And okay, so if you want us to just slap it in there the way that it is right now, congruent with the legacy way of doing things, I'm now going to take that and say, okay, that's part of the overall solution. It's going to take this much this many story points or this many hours to undo that, to address that, so that I can then put in the right solution. And that overall is kind of my principal balance of what I ultimately pay back, including interest. So I wouldn't see the legacy code suddenly, one day, because it's a little bit more obsolete, the whole thing becomes tech debt. It's like, no, it's just that one piece that we needed to do to tack on there.
So it's very interesting, the segregation of the types of technical debt you've got. It sounds like the stuff you've primarily inherited vis-a-vis the legacy code, you don't count in your calculation of forward accrued technical debt, right, incurred. Very interesting delineation there. Not what I would think, on the surface, but yeah, I think it in a way it does present a more accurate basis for a forward-looking measure of tech debt. So very interesting. That's tremendous. Now, Warren, what's your thoughts on leverage and tech debt? And so, feel free to, and sorry to interrupt. And also, another thing I didn't talk about before was the size of your organization and how it may play or factor into the management of such debt.
Okay, I mean, I have to agree with both my panelists. Anytime you write code, you're basically potentially piling on to that technical debt going forward. So we at BuyWriter as well are making very prudent decisions around buy versus build. That's very, very important to us right now. This was an organization that essentially built everything and may have made those decisions for different reasons. But we are not that organization any longer. And we are clearly, if there's a widget out there, and I really don't see a reason to either build a better widget, or even the better widget is going to make a differentiation for my company, I'm probably going to look to buy that platform and integrate. But there's still opportunities for us to build. And we are a company that essentially still runs on a legacy system that was launched back in 2003. It's an on-prem system. So it's kind of a double whammy for me. It's an older system. And to, I think, both Raul's and Ivo's point, you have two different kinds of technical debt there. You have, just code that was written back in the day was probably good, was probably acceptable. And then you have the places where shortcuts were clearly taken. And there may have been all good intention. I'll give my predecessors the benefit of the doubt to go back and clean things up. And of course, we know that never happens. So we're left with a bunch of mess at times that those folks that built that code are no longer here. And I have a determination to retire this platform in 2 years for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's old, it's antiquated, it's a monolith database structure. As well as we want to get ourselves 100% into the cloud. So we look at that tech debt, and at times, we're faced with a decision that we actually have to contend with it. We have to do something to that code because something is not working right. And you have that decision, do I once again take what was originally a shortcut and this is the reason why it's broken? Do I take the time now to truly fix it and fix it properly, even though I know that in the long term, that might be throwaway work? Oftentimes the answer for us is yes, because I don't want to build it broken again. And I know that I won't get to a point to either replace it with a purchased system, or if I'm going to rebuild it, let's say as a microservice up in the cloud with its own data store, I might not get to that for a while, but the business has a need right now. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to deal with those things. There are things on the back end that the business essentially is blind to. They have no idea that it's code that was poorly written. It's a thorn in our side, and the business is not clamoring for it. Nothing's broken on the front end, but we know on the back end, there's stuff that's broken and we have to deal with it every day. We have typically been handling those situations with hackathons. So when I talked about those governance meetings and those quarterly planning sessions, we set aside time not only for break fix and other non-sprint related work, but we also set aside time for 2 hackathons per team. And we try and take a lot of that legacy debt and find something that we truly have been waiting for months or maybe even years to say, we really need to fix this. And we kind of make that the target for a hackathon. And those hackathons are typically a day and a half. The first is the half day where we plan the hackathon, and then we come back and then we actually do the hackathon for a full day, feed everybody, come in and we tackle that problem and get it done. So, you know, again, managing technical debt has been a balancing act for us. Again, our organization, I've got 3 agile teams that are dedicated to various different products. I've got an IT organization of about 50 people. And this is servicing an organization of, you know, when you include our franchise folks who we do service, and most of our dealerships are franchise owned, about 4,000 end users. So we're not saving lives as Ivo is, but we're selling cars, and maybe in a turn that kind of saves some lives, if you will. But it's a delicate balancing act for us, one that we have to contend with. I will build new where I can and not have to kind of throw away that work, but at times we have to deal with it.
Yeah, indirectly you're saving lives, I'm sure. I mean, anything with automobiles. What I love about your approach here is the introduction of hackathons. I mean, culturally, it's not an innately understandable, you know, event, I would say, for especially a lot of older legacy organizations, and typically I don't associate them with internal efficiency or team building or gamification type of efforts. But I love the way that you've introduced that into, you know, a typical internal development organization is definitely unique. Hopefully that trend will continue, and maybe some of the folks watching today will bring that back now to their respective organizations. So we've got some questions. I wanted to tell everybody that has submitted a question, we'll get to you in just a moment. So we've got about 15 more minutes. In the next 2 minutes, I'd like to throw out an open question to the panel. And let's come back hopefully with some quantitative measures. What I'm looking for is effective metrics that may help a lot of our viewers here today kind of quantify the efforts that they're doing around improvement of their development life cycles and a lot of the different subjects that we've talked to here. So I'll just throw that out to everybody real quick for the next 2 or 3 minutes, and then I've got a couple of questions from the audience. So metrics, any ones that don't work that are commonly known, any unique ones you may want to use, anybody?
Well,
Go ahead, Warren. Go ahead.
I mean, at a very high level, you know, obviously very obvious to everybody. You know, we look at releases and how many, you know, turnbacks do we have to have? As we release product and code, our goal is to release it and have it fully tested and not have to be backed out. As is at the highest level, things that we're measuring. Other areas that we're capturing are with regard to bugs and those types of tickets. We measure that not only in the quantity of tickets per team, but also in the time that is spent on those tickets. And we take a look at that each and every month, and we see how we're trending. And we balance that against the efficiencies of the team. So we look at acceleration and velocity of each of the agile teams and how that compares to, the amount of velocity is around story points and things like that versus unplanned work. So we're measuring both of those pieces of work that come into a team. And typically what you'd see is if you've got a lot of unplanned work, you would think your velocity would take a dip. And then we take a look at why that might have happened. Was that a result of releases that we had to back out and then fix? And we do that kind of post-mortem each and every time.
So what my team does is, I gave an example earlier about, how we assess or quantify technical debt, right? And I would say that what's worked well for my teams in the past is to have two roadmaps. There's the product roadmap that the business sees, and then there's the technical roadmap that the business doesn't quite see. They don't really care. But earlier I also talked about, scheduled work, non-scheduled work, and allocation of that. And for what we do, it depends on the team, depends on the product and what's going on, how much technical debt we have to repay. But we might say, 80% of the time we're going to be working on the product. 20% of the time we're going to be working on the technical needs that the team has to do better work, to be more, not just more productive, but effective in what they're doing so that the quality doesn't go down. I have developers approach me all the time and say, here's a gap in what we're doing. And it's not impacting the business today, but it's just waiting to happen. And in healthcare, any gap could result in loss of patient life, right? And Warren, even though he's not saving lives directly, like the software we're writing, but he's delivering the saving of livelihoods, right? Transportation is so key to livelihoods. Right. And I think that having two roadmaps and being able to put one roadmap in front of the business, say, here's what you're going to get, but at the same time, I need to take care and nurture the organization of IT so that they're doing good work and not just always flying by the seat of their pants, is also good. And they have to kind of work together to prioritize in kind of a common backlog that says, here's what we're going to work on, either this sprint, this iteration next, whether it's product related or more tech backlog created. And the last thing I'll say is, I know that a lot of people track velocity, and devs tend to look at velocity as what they're obligated to deliver, right? Here's how many story points we must deliver every sprint, every cycle, or whatever. But what I would actually do is flip that and say that capacity, that velocity metric is really our capacity. It's actually used to protect you so that you don't overcommit beyond this. And whether you say that the velocity is more tied to the product roadmap so that we don't commit to more than this for the product roadmap, and anything else, any other time that you have is spent whittling down and making progress in the technical roadmap, then all the better for the company.
Yeah, great feedback. Rahul, you've got to have some metrics. I mean, you're running a factory for heaven's sake.
Yeah, so let me just start by saying, I think in most organizations, the quality and productivity are always seem to be at loggerheads with each other, and every project manager kind of feels like they're making a trade-off all the time. Mm-hmm. During every release, they say, oh, I can invest time here, but not there, and so on. We've kind of come to learn, at least at scale, that they are really not at loggerheads. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. If you focus on quality, you kind of automatically get the productivity. And there are two ways to do it. One is you can actually coach your developers to not produce those issues in code in the first place. And when you do that and you solve the problem at the source, you don't see these problems propagate. The reason why you have this notional trade-off is every organization today, the way they think about quality is a filter mechanism. So let's say you produce 100 units of work, which is code you've written, that little bit commits or whatever. The only way we test quality today is by adding filters, whether it's in your CI/CD process, whether it's in testing or whatever other environment, right? And that's a production anti-pattern, because if you just keep adding more and more filters, you're just going to get less and less stuff out of the door at the end of the day. And the better your quality org gets, they're just adding more filters, just adding new rules and new filters all the time. Okay, and that just means that for every 100 units you produce, you get 2 units out. And that makes no sense. That is the notional trade-off that people are building in their head. Where If you want quality, I'm going to add more filters, and I'm going to get less and less stuff out of the door. But on the other hand, if you coach your developers, if you spend time coaching your developers to fix the problem at the root, and you're constantly measuring it and coaching it post facto, but constantly coaching, constantly having, this is almost like, the way coaches coach in athletics, where you have game film at the end of every game, and you're reviewing exactly what happened. And every week you have a coach who's sitting down and saying, here's what we introduced in the code last week, with each developer, not as a team, with each individual developer. If you sit down and you say, this is what you did last week, let's try and make sure you never repeat it next week. And then you go back next week and then you hammer it again. You suddenly find that in about 6 to 8 weeks, you can eliminate that behavior completely, and those issues never show up. And at that point, you can go add a filter to make sure that you're never introducing that problem again, because you've eliminated the behavior. You don't expect to see it in the future. And this is a precautionary filter or a safety net, right? Not a production anti-pattern. So that's one way to solve it. And that's the kind of approach that we take. We literally look at issues in code that are offered by a lot of these sensors. We call them sensors. You got tools like Sonar and so on. Now they're terrible from a accuracy standpoint. The false positive rates on these tools are just so incredibly high. On a typical million line code base, it's not uncommon to see about 500,000 issues. Okay, and when you have that volume, you just don't know where to start, right? And that's because the number of false positives is just so insanely high. So we've spent the last decade trying to work out. We built tools ourselves to figure out how to reduce the false positive rates dramatically. We've had to build a product called Code Graph ourselves that actually, looks at a different way of trying to identify similar problems, but without the false positive. Without the false positives. As long as you have that, that's a decent metric. But again, you have to be very conscious about the false positive rates. Otherwise, you can't trust the data at all. However, I think where we are headed down in the future is a developer's job is changing dramatically and in a more accelerated way today than ever before. Warren talked about the hackathons. And I think the hackathons are a prime indicator of where we are headed. Developers are no longer people who write code, but I think developers are going to be valuable for the most efficient way in which they can stitch together components that are readily available to them, right? The hackathons are literally a symptom of that. You want someone to come in, think of an idea, and stitch together a bunch of pieces as a proof of concept. But going forward, I think that's going to be the pattern, right? Like if you had a CRUD applications, you're now no longer thinking about search algorithms. Like when I started as a developer, right, our entire education was around what kind of search algorithms are the most optimal? What kind of, like, I don't know if anyone in the last 5 years has looked at the algorithm that drives the collections library in Java. Everyone just uses the collections library, but I don't think anyone has really gone in to see how it's implemented. Is it the most optimal algorithm in there? Like we obsessed about those things back in the day because memory was scarce and your compute resources were scarce. So you had to build those algorithms, from scratch to be most efficient. And that was your training. Today, you don't need to do any of that stuff. Today, the skill that's really valuable is how you stitch together a bunch of different components to do the task or to deliver the product that you really want. And that's a completely different kind of skill, right? And the metrics that you need to measure over there are also very different. And I think the whole problem of technical debt and quality and productivity all being at loggerheads in the legacy way of doing software development is going to transform, because stitching code to do stuff is productive to start with because you're just doing stitching, you're not building anything from scratch. You just got a brilliant idea that you're implementing in a different configuration. Think of it like Lego blocks. You're trying to put together Lego blocks and you can have infinite permutations and combinations of what you produce. That's what I see developers evolving into in the future. And therefore, the notion of technical debt is going to be how quickly you can restitch, how quickly you can reconfigure the existing product to do something more with every iteration. And so I think we have to evolve new metrics for technical debt as we go forward.
Yeah, agreed. God, I wish we had more than an hour just to talk on that subject. I mean, we can go on and on. We've got about 5 more minutes. I want to at least touch on the 2 questions that were asked by our folks. So real quick answers, because I think we've answered some of this already. So I apologize in advance. I'm just going to throw out the questions, maybe some quick answers if at all possible. First question is, we've got somebody that's building a development team at a startup. They're saying that they lack experience in doing so. Do you any quick tips on how to improve productivity when quality could be a potentially bigger challenge?
I would love to take that, James, if I could.
Sure.
So what I would say is that if you're at a startup and you're trying to manage the productivity versus quality at a startup, you have one additional element that the enterprise doesn't have as much, which is risk management, because everything that you're putting out now has a greater risk of success or failure versus, it's maybe this one little thing isn't working right? That's going to lead your dev team to try and boil the ocean at once. I mean, they're going to try to build the finished product or the MVP or whatever it is in one go, and you're going to fail if you do that. You're going to amass so much tech debt because you're not going to be managing it. You're basically having your dev team write a blank check for tech debt that you will not be able to cash later. Yeah. So you have to be able to manage the risk of which parts do they focus on, which parts do they need to really emphasize the quality, and which parts maybe could, they can come back and replace with something later. And I love, what Rahul said earlier about, challenging the developers of, okay, if you had to come in and replace this code later, how would you do that, right? Because this part of the code base is just going to suck, and you just have to deal with it. You just have to accept it. But which part of the code base do you really want to emphasize the quality and manage the risks there? And the way that you do that also is in product management. Ensure that you're not trying to create the thing at once, but more so in chunks and pieces, even if parts of those need to be refactored in order to add the next piece on, so that you have greater certainty and confidence that what you're building is sustainable versus just, okay, it's one big thing that the MVP, that needs to be seen for the MVP, and then now later on you have to rewrite 80% of it. That doesn't help you at all. So hopefully that feedback helps.
Don't write checks you can't cash. I got that one down.
Exactly.
All right, real quick, we've got a couple minutes. Any thoughts on predicting productivity issues before starting a project? Anything quick? And then I've got one more question after this.
I have 2, unless my other panelists like to.
Sorry. Anybody? Yeah, anybody.
So I think the one thing that's a constant is that as the number of lines of code in your code base grow, your quality problems will grow exponentially, and your productivity will also decline exponentially. It's a rule we've seen. You can manage small code bases really well, both on quality and productivity, and then as your code base size increases, it will just drop and kill you. And that's a given. I think that's universally understood by anyone who's been dealing with software for a while. The key is keep the number of lines of code that you're managing as low as possible. If you're a startup, train your team to just stitch things together. That's the easiest way to kind of replace things. You will amass less technical debt. You have less stuff holding all these pieces together, and you can iterate a lot faster as well. It directly complements your goals of productivity and quality. The one mechanic that we use within a lot of our new product development is imagine that every line of code cost you $1,000. What decisions would you make? Yeah. Like every line of code that you had to add in, you had to justify why you added that in, and is it really necessary? And if you kind of follow simple rules like that, and like I said earlier, have people justify why it would be super easy to delete the line of code that they wrote, I think you'll generally be in good shape, both on quality and productivity.
Yeah, like the $1,000. One last thing, we got about a minute left. Real quick, any productivity tools that you recommend? Couple, handful that you could rip out.
It used to be called Git Prime. I think it's now Pluralsight Flow is pretty good. and letting you see the activities of your developers, not just by code commits, but pull requests. Also, if they're working on code that somebody else wrote, maybe they're the ones that are always in there fixing everybody else's mess, so they don't seem like they're producing as much. But there's those people you want to keep because they're the ones willing to get into the legacy stuff that nobody else wants to, right? So I would say Pluralsight flow is pretty good. Just on the pricing aspect, make sure you negotiate that.
And Warren, with the hackathons, you use any? You're on mute, Warren. Warren, I'm just curious. Do you have any tools you use in conjunction with the hackathons that are unique?
You know, look, not that I'm aware. We've gone into those. We were still analyzing a lot of the tool sets that are out there. I know that from a deployment standpoint, whatnot, we leverage Azure DevOps and Bitbucket, but nothing I can say particularly around the hackathons.
Okay.
I just
Go ahead, Rahul.
Sorry. I'll just add that DevGraph has a tool called Beehive for large enterprises where you have, at least a few hundred developers, if not more, ideally a few thousand developers, where we can do behavior modeling of your developers and really understand the kind of behaviors you want to change in the way they're writing code and, the kind of code that they are putting into the code bases. And then we can help that educate the coaching that each individual developer needs to get. It's something that we built internally for ourselves, but are now bringing to market. So that's something that we found incredibly useful internally.
Excellent. Guys, this brings us to the top of the hour. Once again, thank you so much. We could have gone on another hour, easily. I mean, I've got a tremendous amount out of it, and I'm happy to hear everybody share their insights on code quality. Max, I think we're all set.
Yeah, amazing. Well, fantastic conversation. Thanks to all our speakers. We really appreciate you taking the time. We know you're super busy, so we appreciate you sharing your insight with us. Thanks to all the attendees for tuning in as well and joining the session. I hope you found value in joining us. We have recorded the webinar, so we'll try and make that live for everyone tomorrow, so you can check it out on demand if there were any key insights you want to revisit. And finally, yeah, thanks to DevGraph, who sponsored this webinar and made it possible. Be sure to go and check out their software suite if you haven't already. And if you want to chat to anyone from their organization, just find Raul on LinkedIn or shoot me a message and I'll put you in touch. So yeah, thanks so much, guys. We really appreciate it.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving,
Happy
everyone.
Thanksgiving. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.